Hello, my friend. Tonight, we'll step quietly into a medieval monastery, not as a visitor, but as a scribe. Not one of the singing brothers in the chapel, but the one hunched over parchment, ink-stained and squinting, hour after hour. Maybe quiet stories like this help you feel a little more at ease. If they do, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always calming to know we're all here, quietly together. Now, dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, and let's drift back, slowly, into a medieval monastery. There was never enough light inside the scriptorium. Even on clear days, the sun barely reached beyond the narrow-slit windows. These windows weren't made to brighten rooms. They were made to protect, to isolate, to remind the monks that the world outside no longer concerned them. The stone walls swallowed daylight, letting only a dull, muted glow settle across the floor. Shadows didn't move so much as stretch and hang. White parchment wasn't white at all in this place. It was grey, heavy, absorbing what little light there was. The scribe bent forward, slowly, inevitably, as if pulled down by the dimness itself. The more the eyes strained, the closer the body folded into the desk. Forehead hovered above ink. Breath touched the page. Soon the head cast a shadow over the very text being copied. The hours weren't marked by clocks, but by the moment the letters blurred into fog. It always came earlier than expected. Candles were no comfort. They were rationed, counted, reserved for when the abbot allowed them. A few for the whole room, barely enough to see each other's faces, let alone the curvature of a letter. The flames trembled constantly, disturbed by draughts, footsteps, murmured prayers. Each flicker made the shadows dance across the manuscript, warping the lines, interrupting the rhythm of writing. And yet the hand had to keep moving. The wax dripped, sometimes onto fingers, sometimes onto parchment, and each drop was a reminder that nothing in this place was stable. Not the light, not the warmth, not the hand that held the quill. The wicks burned unevenly. The smoke rose and clung to the lungs. The smell of burning tallow mixed with dust and old paper, making the air thicker than silence. The eyes burned, not just from effort, but from everything that touched them. The smoke, the dark, the despair. Eyes didn't tire. They surrendered. Slowly, day by day, letter by letter, they gave up. What started as a need to squint became a permanent narrowing of vision. The lines split in two. Ink seemed to crawl where it should rest. Monks didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. The red rims around the pupils said enough. Some scribes began to bring the parchment closer, not by lifting it, but by lowering themselves. Backs bent further, necks tightened, noses nearly touched the page. But nothing helped. Light wasn't something one could pray into existence. It came and left according to the seasons and the abbot's rules. Artificial light was expensive. Natural light was fleeting. The rest was shadow. Eventually, the body adapted in its own quiet way. Muscles hardened in strange postures. Blinks became longer, slower, but never restful. Some scribes began to memorize the order of letters, not because they understood the words, but because it was easier than chasing them in the dark. Mistakes were inevitable. Entire lines could vanish behind a sudden tilt of the candle. And when that happened, the pen had to stop, the breath had to hold, and the page had to be scraped, slowly, carefully, with a knife. One stroke too deep, and the parchment tore. Then the whole sheet was lost. Hours gone, all because the light had flickered or faded or never truly arrived in the first place. The hand never truly rested. It clutched the quill from morning until dusk, then sometimes even beyond, locked in a grip so precise it bordered on unnatural. The muscles between the fingers hardened first, silent knots that formed under the skin like grains of stone. The quill was narrow and uneven, carved from the feather of a bird that had never imagined such use. It had to be held delicately, yet firmly, or else it would splinter mid-stroke. This tension, always firm, never relaxed, turned the hand into something less like flesh and more like a tool. Over time, the fingers curled in on themselves, not from cold, but from habit. Joints swelled. The middle knuckle grew large and smooth, while the tips of the fingers flattened from constant pressure. No one noticed at first. It happened slowly. The hand began to remember the shape of work, even when it wasn't working. At meals, it twitched. At prayers, it remained half-curled. Even in sleep, it gripped the air. The pain was never sharp. It was a dull throb that began near the wrist and crawled outward. It spread like fatigue, like moisture through old cloth. The thumb took the worst of it, always bearing the pressure from above. It would lock without warning, refusing to extend. Some monks began wearing cloth wraps to soften the friction, but it only helped for a time. The movement required to form a clean script wasn't natural. Every curve of every letter had to be identical to the last. And that demanded micro-adjustments, flicks of the fingers so tiny and so frequent they built up into something damaging. By the end of each day, the fingers ached as if they'd been hitting stone, though they had only traced ink onto skin. Some joints began to pop audibly when flexed. Others didn't move at all. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was how normal it became. The body adjusted, the mind accepted. The work continued. There was no space for recovery. The tools had no sympathy. The quill wasn't heavy, but it became heavier the longer it was held. It slipped when the fingers went numb. It cracked when pressed too hard. And when it broke, another had to be prepared, trimmed, shaped, tested on scrap, all with the same tired hand. The ink didn't care either. It required just enough pressure to flow, but not so much that it bled. That balance had to be struck again and again, line after line, with fingers that trembled not from fear or cold, but from effort. No warm compresses, no oil for joints. Just more parchment, more prayer, more of the same. In winter, the fingers went stiff. In summer, they swelled. The skin around the nails dried and peeled. The flesh beneath the rings of ink stains hardened until it no longer felt like skin at all. Some scribes began to chew on their own fingers out of frustration, just enough to feel something sharp, just enough to remind themselves the hand was still theirs. Eventually, the damage became permanent. Fingers froze into shapes they could no longer undo. The hand, once capable of holding a chalice or turning a page, became fit for only one motion: writing. Not because of skill, but because of limitation. There were monks who could no longer open their palms fully, even when they tried. Their hands stayed half-closed, like claws, even in sleep. The tendons shortened, the bones curved. Some had to hold their wrist with the other hand just to finish a sentence. Others simply wrote slower. No one stopped. Stopping wasn't allowed. The work was sacred, they said. The pain didn't matter. The hand didn't matter. The fingers didn't need comfort. They needed obedience. And so the writing went on. Not with grace, not with joy, but with bodies slowly curling into the shape of their labor. Not a punishment, not a miracle. Just routine. Just the cost of letters. The air inside the scriptorium never changed. It clung to the stone, to the robes, to the skin. It wasn't foul, not exactly, but it was thick and constant, a blend of everything that settled there over time. The smell of parchment came first. Animal skin, treated and scraped, still carrying traces of what it once was. It gave off a faint sourness, like something preserved against its will. Layered on top was the wax from countless candles, burned low and slow, releasing a greasy sweetness that stuck to the nostrils. That scent didn't fade when the flame went out. It lingered in the walls, the benches, the folds of the monks' sleeves. Dust added its own note, dry, brittle, with the faint sting of old fibers, as if the very air had been ground from paper. No window was ever open wide enough to clear it. There was no breeze in those rooms, no relief. Bodies made the rest. Robes soaked in sweat from hours of stillness gave off a dull, cloth-heavy musk. The monks did not bathe often. Water was scarce, warmth even more so. And so the air filled with the slow, steady exhalation of dozens of men who rarely spoke but always breathed. It smelled of breath and bodies, of silence and effort. Sometimes one would cough and stir it up, setting the layers of scent back into motion like dust shaken from a blanket. Meals left their mark too. Onions, fish, broth too long boiled. The scriptorium became a place where everything mingled, where every surface absorbed and then returned the smell of life trapped in repetition. Even the ink had a scent, metallic, bitter, mixed with vinegar and age. It hovered near the pages, stronger, where fresh, fading into the blend as it dried, but never fully gone. Nothing was fragrant, nothing was fresh, and yet, over time, the smell became a presence. It marked the difference between the outer world and this one. Those who entered from the gardens would pause at the threshold, catching it like a wave. Those who lived inside barely noticed. Their clothes carried it beyond the walls, their skin held it into the night. It crept into their beds, into the straw, into the folds behind the knees and under the arms. A monk could wake from a dream and know where he was by scent, alone. The odour of the scriptorium wasn't hostile, it was familiar, even comforting in its persistence. But it was never clean. It spoke of labour and time, of hands that did not stop moving, of pages turned not for joy, but for duty. It was the smell of nothing ever drying completely, of nothing ever fully washed, of breath never held for long enough. And still, it was never discussed. No one named it, no one complained. It was simply what the place was. The new initiates gagged quietly at first, or breathed through sleeves until they too grew used to it. There was no escape from it, only surrender. To leave the scriptorium was to miss it. To stand in fresh air felt wrong, too thin, too sharp, too exposed. The monks carried the smell like a second habit, unwashed, unchosen, inseparable from the work they did. And when they died, their robes were burned, not because of ritual, but because nothing else could remove what time had embedded. The pages they left behind kept only the ink, but anyone who held them for long enough could imagine the rest. The scent of parchment, wax, dust, and skin, pressed together, forever. Every letter had weight, not metaphorical, but physical. A single letter out of place could unravel the meaning of an entire passage, and with it, the work of an entire day. There were no second chances, no backspace, no gentle erasing with a smile. Ink didn't forgive. It sank into the fibres of the parchment with finality, permanent and immediate. The lines were meant to be even, the script uniform, the spacing precise. But human hands shook, eyes blurred, minds drifted under the weight of repetition. One skipped word, one missed letter, and the balance of the text collapsed. Some scribes kept a finger hovering over the last written word, trying to keep their place. Others counted syllables aloud under their breath. None of it was foolproof. Mistakes happened anyway, quietly, invisibly at first, until the line was finished, and the error sat there, plain as day, unblinking. The discovery of a mistake was a slow unravelling. First, there was the pause. Then, the sharp inward breath. A hand frozen mid-air, ink already forming on the nib for a letter that could no longer be written. Sometimes the error was a single stroke, an accidental curve, a flick too long, a serif bent the wrong way. But in a language where shape determined meaning, it was enough. The correction methods were crude and painful. Some tried scraping away the ink with a knife, but it tore the parchment more often than not. Others attempted to overwrite the error, making a clean line into a mess of layered pigment. In both cases, the damage remained. The page, once clean and filled with order, was now spoiled. And a spoiled page wasn't repaired. It was set aside, discarded. Days of work, gone in the shape of a single wrong letter. There was no formal punishment, no shouting, no strike of the cane. But the silence that followed a mistake was heavy. The others noticed. A pause in writing was a rupture in the rhythm of the room. Heads would lift, eyes would flick toward the source. No one spoke, but everyone knew. The scribe would lower his gaze, close the book, and begin again. Not from the sentence, not from the paragraph, but from the beginning of the page. Sometimes from the beginning of the chapter. Some texts required complete consistency, not only in content, but in appearance. If one letter was malformed, all was suspect. And so the labour recommenced, with fresh parchment, fresh ink, fresh weariness. But the memory of the mistake lingered, thick as the smell of wax, coiled in the spine like guilt. It slowed the hand, dulled the focus, made the next error more likely. And errors multiplied when fear took hold. Anxiety made fingers tighten, made ink blot, made the quill catch where it should glide. The more precise the scribe tried to be, the more the script resisted. Some monks began to whisper prayers under their breath, not for inspiration, but for steadiness. Others became mechanical, shutting down thought entirely, moving letter by letter like cogs in a wheel. But that too had a cost. It was easier to misread when the mind no longer processed the words, easier to write domino when the text called for domini, easier to repeat a line or skip one entirely. And so each page became a test not only of discipline but of endurance, not just of skill but of fragility. The work demanded perfection, and perfection demanded something more than human. Yet it was humans who held the quill, and the parchment remembered every one of their faults. The words flowed onto the page, but they didn't belong to the hand that wrote them. They came from ancient mouths, from scholars and priests, from councils and creeds that lived centuries before. The ink ever touched the parchment. Latin dominated every line, complex, rigid, and cold. It wasn't the language of daily speech. It wasn't the language of thoughts or prayers, not for most of those who copied it. It was distant, formal, and utterly alien. The scribes wrote syllable after syllable with practiced ease, and yet the meaning remained veiled. Grammar was memorized, not understood. Syntax was followed by rote, not by instinct. The words may as well have been stone carvings, shapes to be reproduced, not concepts to be absorbed. The sentences were long, winding, wrapped in themselves. And through all of it, the hands moved steadily, recording what the mind did not truly grasp. Some tried to understand. They paused over unfamiliar phrases, mouthing them silently, hoping recognition would come. Occasionally, a word seemed familiar, linked perhaps to scripture or chant. But context was slippery. The lines were dense, the clauses stacked like bricks, each one demanding more than what a tired, hungry scribe could give. Interpretation was not part of the job. That belonged to theologians, to abbots, to men with titles and time. The scribe's duty was to preserve, not to question, to trace, not to interpret. And so even sacred texts became mechanical. Psalms turned into patterns. Epistles became rhythms of ink. There was a strange dissonance in it, copying holy doctrine without feeling its weight, handling divine instruction without letting it pass through the soul. The labor was precise. The purpose was blurred. The holiness of the task lay not in comprehension, but in execution. Occasionally, a passage stirred discomfort, not from clarity, but from hints. A phrase repeated too often, a word that reappeared with unusual frequency. The patterns were noticed before the meanings were. But asking questions wasn't welcomed. Most scribes kept their doubts buried beneath the surface. Understanding was a luxury they couldn't afford. There were too many pages to copy, too many margins to illuminate, too many deadlines whispered in soft authority. And so, ignorance became armor. One could write something 1,000 times without ever absorbing its truth. Hands memorized forms, eyes memorized spacing. But the soul remained outside the text, observing without entering. Some found comfort in that distance. It meant the errors weren't theological, only technical. Others felt a quiet sadness, knowing their lives were spent repeating what they would never truly know. Over the years, the language took on a life of its own, not as communication, but as structure. It became something to be aligned, measured, controlled. Latin wasn't spoken in the refectory or muttered during chores. It was reserved for books, for chants, for correction. It loomed above the monks like a ceiling, beautiful, ornate, and unreachable. Those who mastered it lived differently, closer to power, closer to decision. The rest continued their work in silence, surrounded by meanings they couldn't access. Some pages described sins they'd never commit, punishments they'd never suffer, salvations they'd never understand. But the lines had to be clean. The lettering had to match. The meaning could wait, or disappear entirely. And so the scribes remained beneath the words, not within them, building towers of text they would never climb. The ink dried, the pages turned, and the language stayed exactly where it had always been, just out of reach. The cold inside the scriptorium was not the kind that stung, it was the kind that crept. It entered slowly through the soles of the feet, climbed the legs, settled in the lower back, and spread outward like ink in water. The stone walls held no warmth, only the memory of last night's frost. In winter, breath fogged the air even indoors, hanging for a moment before dissolving into the stillness. Candles gave light, but no heat. Layers of wool robes dulled the chill, but didn't banish it. The body remained upright, motionless for hours, muscles clenched against the numbness. Even the act of writing, with its small movements and careful strokes, couldn't generate warmth. The fingertips paled first, then the joints stiffened. The quill felt harder in the hand, less like a tool and more like something frozen to the touch. But the work did not stop. It never stopped. The script had to continue, even as sensation slipped away. Ink turned sluggish in the bottle, thickening at the edges, resisting the dip of the nib. Sometimes it froze outright, forming a crystalline skin that had to be broken with the tip of a knife. Once on the page, it dried unevenly, dark in the center, pale at the edges, brittle as it set. Blots became common, not from carelessness, but from cold hands failing to control the pressure. Corrections were harder. The blade used to scrape errors stiffened with frost. Pages cracked more easily in the chill. Each breath clouded the view of the parchment, forcing the scribe to pause, wipe his sleeve, and continue. Still, no one complained. Cold was part of the order, like silence and obedience. Complaining was a waste of air, and air was precious when the lungs struggled to warm it. The body curled slightly forward, unconsciously seeking shelter where there was none. The mind moved faster than the limbs, but that too began to slow. Cold didn't just dull the fingers, it dulled thought. Concentration fractured as the hours passed. The text blurred, not from lack of light or knowledge, but from the way pain became background noise. First, it was an ache. Then it was something else. Something that had no name but made the body feel hollow and brittle. The rhythm of writing faltered. Letters grew crooked. Lines bent slightly downward as the wrist weakened. Some scribes tried to blow warm air onto their hands, but the relief lasted only seconds. Others tucked their fingers under their arms during moments of pause, hoping for a flicker of heat. But the page demanded their return. The script waited. The candle flickered. The room remained silent except for the scratch of quill against skin and the occasional crack of freezing ink. Eventually, the body gave up trying to stay warm. It entered a kind of stillness, not peaceful, but resigned. Fingers no longer bent fully, wrists moved only from memory. The pages were turned with stiff hands, sometimes with elbows, or the side of the palm when the fingers could no longer grasp. And still, the work continued. The cold was no excuse. The text had to be preserved, transmitted, copied. It didn't matter how the scribe felt. His comfort wasn't the goal. His understanding wasn't required. Only the page mattered. Only the shape of the letters. The cold reminded him of that constantly, not with cruelty, but with constancy. It wrapped around the spine, sat beneath the ribs, pressed behind the eyes. It stayed long after the ink dried, and when the scriptorium finally emptied at the end of the day, it lingered in the bones. Quiet, patient, ready to return tomorrow. The sound of a quill breaking wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A soft, sharp crack, so minor it could be missed by anyone outside the scriptorium, but to those within, it was deafening. It came without warning, interrupting the slow rhythm of writing like a stone thrown into still water. One moment the pen glided across the parchment, and the next it splintered at the tip, catching on the fibers, dragging a jagged line where a clean stroke was meant to be. The ink bled sideways, ruining the letter. Sometimes it ruined the word. Occasionally, it ruined the page. The pause that followed wasn't just about damage, it was about consequence. A broken quill meant delay, not minutes of rest, but minutes of repair. The entire hand froze, suspended above the parchment, as if stunned. And then, without a word, the work of reshaping had to begin. The replacement quill was never quite the same. Each feather came with its own imperfections, each shaft a different balance of strength and flexibility. The cutting process demanded precision. The blade had to be sharp, the angle exact, the tip narrow but not fragile. Cold fingers made this harder. So did fatigue. One slip, and the new nib cracked before it ever touched ink. Even when successful, the quill had to be tested, dipped, drawn, checked for consistency. Lines were scratched onto scrap parchment, rows of test letters formed in silence. All of this took time stolen from the day's quota, time that the page did not forgive. Around the scriptorium, others continued writing, their pens scratching steadily, their hands unmoved. The broken quill became a private failure, even though it happened to everyone. No one was exempt. Some carried spare quills tucked into their sleeves, but even those broke in turn. Feather after feather, splinter after splinter, the rhythm of labor was fragile, always one crack away from collapse. Feathers were not chosen for beauty. They were stripped of color, of decoration, of softness. What mattered was function. Goose feathers were preferred for their size, but even the best ones wore down quickly. After enough lines, the tip would dull, the slit widen, the ink begin to flow too heavily. The scribe would notice the change mid-word. The line would grow too thick, the curve too heavy. Another pause, another adjustment. It was rare that a single quill survived an entire page, rarer still for it to last through a chapter. The failure was built in, inevitable, expected. And yet each break brought frustration, a tightening in the jaw, a weight behind the eyes. There was no one to blame, no fault in the hand, just material giving way to pressure again and again. The scriptorium was filled with these quiet defeats. The waste pile grew silently. Splintered tips, failed cuts, ruined scraps, each one a reminder that even the tools resisted the work. And still, the writing resumed. No one stopped for long. The reshaped quill dipped back into ink, trembling slightly, uncertain of its own sharpness. The lines picked up again, but the tempo was off. It took time to re-enter the flow, to let the fingers trust the tool again. Some scribes held their breath for the first few strokes, watching for signs of failure. Others leaned closer to the page, narrowing their focus, isolating themselves from the room around them. The break had disrupted more than the pen. It had broken the illusion of continuity. But there was no space to dwell. The passage waited. The day pressed on. The candle burned lower. And somewhere, beneath the ink and effort, another feather waited to crack. Another pause approached, another reshaping, another moment of silence where the only sound was the memory of a soft, splintering click. The curve began quietly. It didn't announce itself with a crack or a sudden pain, but with small shifts. Imperceptible changes in posture that became permanent before anyone noticed. The scriptorium was not designed for comfort. Benches were flat, hard, and narrow. Desks were simple slabs of wood, angled slightly forward, just enough to encourage a hunch. And so the body leaned. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. The neck dipped closer to the page, the shoulders crept forward. The spine, pulled down by hours of stillness, adjusted without permission. There were no cushions, no supports, no moments of reprieve. The work demanded stillness, and stillness demanded sacrifice. Each day the same position, each hour the same angle. And slowly, the back stopped resisting. It accepted the bend. It forgot how to stand straight. Pain came, but not in the way most imagined. It wasn't sharp. It was dull and patient, like weight pressing in from behind. The middle of the back began to ache first, a soreness that returned every morning and never quite left at night. Then, the base of the spine grew tired, as if it too were waiting for permission to rest. Shifting brought no relief. Standing only reminded the body how unnatural the curve had become. At meals, the monks sat the same way they wrote. At prayers, they knelt in stillness, their backs never truly rising. Even in sleep, the posture lingered. Straw bedding and wooden boards didn't offer enough give to stretch the muscles or realign the joints. The spine remembered its position too well. It held its shape through every hour, adapting not for function, but for survival. Some tried to resist. They straightened their backs during chant, rolled their shoulders between lines, arched briefly before reaching for more ink. But the correction never lasted. Fatigue always won. The muscles weren't trained for variety. They were trained for one motion only, the downward bend. Over time, even the ribs shifted. Breathing became shallower, slower. The chest didn't expand like it used to. The lungs pressed against bones that had slowly turned inward. A few monks began to limp without knowing why. Others could no longer lift their heads fully without pain. There were no names for these conditions, no diagnoses, no treatments, just habit, posture, and silence. The abbots called it discipline. The scribes called it nothing at all. It was simply how the body felt after years of doing the same thing every day. Eventually, the curve was no longer something that could be undone. It became part of the body's architecture. The spine bent like an old branch, not broken, but set in its angle. Those who looked on saw only stillness. They didn't see the tension in the muscles, the ache behind the shoulder blades, the quiet sighs between pages. No one commented. No one needed to. The shape said enough. And when the scribe stood, it was with the slow, careful motion of someone lifting weight they could not name. The world remained tilted, even when upright. The horizon never seemed quite level again. But the quill fit more naturally in the hand now. The page sat perfectly beneath the eyes. The desk welcomed the curve of the back. The body had become what the work required, and the work, as always, continued. The illuminations looked beautiful when finished, gold leaf catching what little light there was, deep blues and crimsons curling into floral shapes, saints framed by swirling vines, animals peering from corners with quiet absurdity. To the reader, they seemed like gifts, small bursts of color and imagination breaking the monotony of text. But for the one who painted them, they were not moments of joy, they were hours of strain. Each curve had to be precise. Each pigment had to be mixed by hand with ingredients that stained skin and stung the eyes. The tools were primitive, the materials fragile. A slip of the brush could ruin what had taken days to plan. Mistakes were unforgivable because the margin for beauty was even smaller than the one for words. No one cared if the hand was cramping, if the wax had gone soft in the heat, or if the brush had lost a hair. The decoration had to be perfect, not expressive, not heartfelt, just perfect. The process was slower than writing. Before the first color touched the page, the design had to be drawn in faint ink or sometimes scored lightly with a knife. The spacing mattered. The angle of the petals, the symmetry of the pattern, the balance between figure and border, each detail demanded attention sharper than the eye could comfortably maintain. Gold leaf came next, applied with a sticky base made from garlic or honey, then pressed and burnished until it shone. The flakes floated in the air like dust, disappearing if not handled with the lightest touch. The paint was made from minerals ground by hand, lapis for blue, vermilion for red, lead white, carbon black. It smelled like earth and vinegar. It dried unevenly. It cracked if the air was too dry. It ran if the parchment had even the faintest trace of oil. Each layer had to dry before the next could begin. And while it dried, the scribe waited, hands idle but mind not at rest. There was no time to admire the work. Once finished, the page was passed along or shelved. The illumination existed not as art, but as function. A mark of reverence, a sign of wealth, a decoration for those who would never know the name or the face behind it. Sometimes the instructions for decoration came from someone else entirely. A scholar, a noble patron, an abbot with opinions but no skill. The scribe had to follow sketches made by others, or replicate an image from a previous volume, regardless of personal judgment. There was no space for invention. The animals had to curl just so. The saints had to wear the correct colors. Even the scrollwork followed patterns laid down generations earlier. It was tradition, not expression. Repetition, not interpretation. And when the hand trembled, or the eye blurred, or the brush faltered, The blame rested not on the task, but on the craftsman. Some illuminators grew bitter, others simply grew numb. They painted not with feeling, but with habit. The movements became automatic, the choices mechanical. What once may have stirred wonder now brought only the ache of the back, the cramp of the fingers, the strain behind the eyes. Yet the page glowed when it was done. That glow didn't reflect pride, it reflected labor. Quiet, repetitive, unthanked labor. The finished image was beautiful because it had to be, not because the creator had loved it. And the next page would need the same gold, the same red, the same border, the same tight, painful brushwork. The reader would smile, the monk would turn the page, the scribe would clean the brush and begin again, not with inspiration, but with resignation. There was no time to admire the light when one was always sitting in shadow. Silence was not a suggestion, it was the law. In the scriptorium, it wrapped itself around every surface, thicker than dust, more binding than the rule. Words were forbidden unless absolutely necessary, and even then, they were offered in whispers or gestures. No conversation passed between desks. No greetings marked the start of the day. The only sounds permitted were the scratch of quills, the soft turning of pages, the occasional creak of wood as bodies shifted in discomfort. Anything more, a cough, a dropped object, even a sigh too loud, felt like a breach. The walls seemed to listen. The silence was so complete that when it was broken, even by accident, it sent a ripple through the room, like a stone disturbing still water. The heads didn't turn, but everyone noticed. The violation sat heavy, even if unspoken. In time, the silence became not just habit, but atmosphere, something absorbed through the skin. It wasn't the peaceful silence of solitude or contemplation. It was a silence of tension, of containment, of withheld breath. Thoughts remained trapped in the mind, looping endlessly without escape. The desire to comment on a passage, to ask for clarification, to share a quiet observation, all of it had to be suppressed. The discipline was constant, the voice withered from disuse. Throats went dry, not from speech, but from never being used. Some monks forgot the sound of their own voices for days at a time. This absence of language didn't bring clarity, it brought fatigue. The mental effort required to remain silent matched the physical strain of writing. Words wanted out, not grand words, just simple ones. Pass the ink, look here, I'm tired. But there was no place for that. The silence served a purpose beyond order. It was meant to discipline not only the tongue, but the self, to erase the boundary between obedience and identity. Even the space itself reinforced the quiet. The stone walls swallowed echoes. The vaulted ceilings trapped sound like breath inside a closed hand. Desks were arranged to discourage eye contact, to keep heads bent downward, to separate each man into his own island of labor. No music played, no wind passed through. The hours unfolded with mechanical precision, and every moment within them was expected to be as silent as the one before. The longer the silence lasted, the heavier it became. Not oppressive, but dense. It pressed down on the chest, settled behind the eyes, turned each internal thought louder by comparison. A single sneeze sounded like a bell. A throat clearing was a disturbance. The discipline was so complete that some scribes learned to move without sound, placing ink pots gently, lifting parchment like glass, stepping only when necessary and only on bare stone. It was not performance, it was survival. And yet, for all its weight, the silence eventually became indistinguishable from the work itself. It entered the body as surely as the ink entered the page. The mind adapted, thoughts slowed to match the pace of the quill. Needs faded. The desire to speak dissolved, replaced by the rhythm of motion and breath. The monks no longer longed for sound, they feared it. When speech was required, during chapter meetings, confessions, or rare instructions, the words came with effort, as though spoken through cloth. Voices cracked from disuse. Some avoided speaking altogether, using signs or nods even when permitted. The silence had shaped them, quietly, completely. And when the day ended and the desks emptied, the stillness didn't break. It followed them into the cloisters, into the cells, into their sleep. Even dreams took place without words. In the scriptorium, silence wasn't the absence of noise. It was a presence of its own, unmoving, patient, and always watching. Dust never arrived loudly. It didn't fall in visible clouds or stir with dramatic weight. It settled slowly, invisibly, in layers too thin to notice at first. It came from the parchment itself, shaved, scraped, and handled so many times that it constantly released a fine residue. The edges of the pages shed fibers with every turn. The covers, often made of leather and wood, carried remnants of past hands, past shelves, past air. As the quill moved, even that subtle motion stirred the dust into the air. It floated upwards in still rooms, suspended just long enough to be drawn in with the next breath. No windows were ever wide enough to carry it away. No draught moved freely through the scriptorium. The dust remained, embedded in the very atmosphere, like ash in a hearth long after the fire is gone. It entered the body without protest. The first signs were minor: an itch behind the eyes, a dryness in the throat. Then came the slow congestion, the cough that never fully resolved, the faint, constant pressure in the sinuses. The monks rarely spoke, but when they did, their voices were rough, worn down not by use, but by the residue of 1,000 manuscripts. The taste of dust became familiar, almost indistinguishable from the taste of ink or wax. It lingered on the tongue, clung to the back of the throat, and settled deep in the lungs where no amount of water or prayer could dislodge it. The act of breathing became a kind of acceptance, of environment, of labour, of particles too fine to resist. Some monks blew their noses into cloth that came away grey. Others ignored the symptoms entirely, having long since folded them into the routine of their work. No one dusted the shelves thoroughly. It was impossible. Every book pulled down released more of it. Every stack shifted brought a new wave. Even the tools, the knife, the stylus, the ink pot, gathered their own film by midday. Wiping them was a temporary gesture, nothing more. The benches creaked under layers that no longer responded to cloth. Dust coated the underside of every desk, the corners of every page, the grain of the stone floor. It existed not as a sign of neglect, but as proof of persistence. The work continued, day after day, regardless of the haze that settled between the ribs. The body didn't fight it, it adapted. Scribes learned to breathe shallowly, to cough discreetly, to avoid touching their faces even as the fine grit gathered in eyebrows, eyelashes, and the cracks of dry skin. Over time, even the sense of smell dulled, overwhelmed by the constant filter of dust in every breath. There were no remedies. No one suggested opening doors or cleaning deeper. The dust was part of the room, like the candlelight, like the silence. It belonged there, and the men who worked within it belonged to it. The pages they copied bore fingerprints not only in oil, but in the invisible trace of what had entered and left their bodies. The lungs suffered quietly. The chest felt heavier in winter. Some monks developed chronic wheezing. Others simply slowed, winded by even the short walk to the cloister. But no records were kept. No one was excused from duty. The body bore what it could, and when it couldn't, it stopped. But the work did not. Another hand took the quill. Another mouth inhaled the same air, and the dust remained, unchallenged, unchanging, always returning. It was not dramatic. It was not cruel. It was just always there, waiting to be breathed. There were no names at the end of the manuscript, no signatures, no dedications, no acknowledgements written in careful script to honor the hand that shaped each letter. The book was complete, the words preserved, the margins illuminated, but the person behind it remained invisible. This was not an oversight. It was by design. The labor of the scribe was considered divine service, an act of humility, of submission. The glory belonged to the text, to the message, to God, not to the one who copied it. Even when a book took years to complete, even when it bore the touch of 1,000 careful decisions, the identity of its creator was erased as surely as dust from a windowsill. The only trace left behind was the uniformity of the handwriting, a script that might someday be recognized by a careful scholar but never praised aloud. The scriptorium was not a place for pride. To draw attention to oneself was to contradict the very foundation of the work. The task was to vanish, to become nothing more than a vessel through which holy words flowed. It was understood that personal expression had no place there. The beauty of the letters, the precision of the spacing, the perfection of the page, all of it was meant to reflect discipline, not selfhood. If a monk dared to insert his name, even in a whisper of ink in a corner, it risked rebuke. In some orders, such acts were punished, not severely, but firmly, because the book was sacred, and the scribe was not. The role of the hand was to disappear behind the ink. Gratitude was reserved for God, for saints, for benefactors, not for those who bent over desks with aching backs and tired eyes. Outside the monastery, patrons sometimes commissioned works, and their names were proudly inscribed: nobles, bishops, abbots. But the hands that did the copying were still anonymous. In rare cases, a scribe's name survived, not as thanks, but as a historical note, buried in a marginal scribble, or in a complaint written more in desperation than vanity. Most of the time, even that was missing. A life could be spent creating books that shaped doctrine, preserved language, and inspired generations. And yet the scribe would die unnamed, unremembered, his handwriting mistaken for someone else's a century later. There was no ceremony at the end of a project, no blessing, no recognition, not even a nod. The final page was completed, the quill set down, and the next task began. One text led to another, one day to the next, and the rhythm of invisibility continued. The absence of thanks did not breed resentment. Not openly. The scribes knew the rules. They accepted them before they took up the quill. But acceptance did not mean the ache wasn't there. It lived in the silence, in the careful brushstroke, in the knowledge that no one would ever say, "You did this well," that the most perfect page would be turned without pause, that the most exquisite decoration would be admired without anyone wondering whose hands had shaped it. The work was eternal, they were told, but not the worker. Only the letters would remain. The hands that made them would be forgotten. And that was the point. Obedience required disappearance. Gratitude had no place in such a structure. There was only the task, and the quiet understanding that when the book was opened 100 years later, the only name inside would be God's. The flame of a candle in the scriptorium was never steady. It shivered at the slightest movement, at the brush of a robe, the shift of a bench, the quiet breath of a nearby monk. It leaned and bent, throwing shadows across the page like crooked branches across snow. The light it offered was not warm, not bright, and never enough. It hovered low, leaving the upper half of the room in dim haze and the lower half in uneven bands of gold and grey. Each candle gave off a faint, greasy smell and a flickering radiance that trembled more than it shone. Pages glowed faintly in the centre, then fell off into blur at the edges. The corners of letters disappeared into darkness. Illuminated margins caught the light unevenly, gold reflecting with harsh brilliance, the reds and blues fading into mud. The flame itself seemed to resent the task, sputtering gently as if to remind those gathered that it too was tired. There was no luxury of multiple sources. Candles were rationed like food, accounted for, trimmed carefully to last the day. At times, a single flame served several desks, and monks leaned in from opposite sides of the same weak glow, their shadows merging on the parchment between them. The wax melted too quickly in summer, too slowly in winter. Wicks bent and burned at awkward angles. The wax sometimes spilled over the side of the holder, leaving hardened pools on the table, on the sleeves, on the backs of hands. Relighting a candle was a task done with reverence and irritation, necessary, delicate, and ultimately futile. The flame always burned out again. When it died mid-sentence, there was nothing to do but wait or continue blindly. And many continued, memorizing the curve of letters, trusting the shape of their own muscle memory more than their blurred vision. The eye strained until it burned, and still the pen moved. Even in midday, the light was weak. Windows were narrow and high, placed to prevent distraction rather than offer illumination. Sunlight entered like an intruder, brief, partial, filtered through dust. At certain angles, it didn't reach the desk at all, instead painting thin lines across the wall or the floor. By the time it reached the parchment, it was already defeated. The candles remained burning even at noon, not because they helped, but because their absence made the task impossible. Monks adjusted their positions constantly, tilting their heads, angling the page, leaning sideways just to catch another sliver of glow. These adjustments brought new aches, necks twisted, shoulders tensed, wrists bent out of alignment. Eyes squinted until the muscles around them throbbed. Vision narrowed. Mistakes multiplied. The light that should have revealed the word instead obscured it, turning clarity into suggestion, suggestion into guesswork. There were no complaints. The expectation was clear. Endure. The work was too important to pause over something as ordinary as poor lighting. The discomfort became routine, the darkness normal. Pages were filled under the kind of light that would be considered failure anywhere else. But in the scriptorium, it was all there was. Candles burned low, wax cooled and hardened, and eyes aged faster than hands. Some monks developed a permanent furrow between their brows, a tension carved by years of squinting into dimness. Others learned to write with their peripheral vision, not because they wanted to, but because their central sight blurred too easily. And when the candle finally guttered and died, it did so with a quiet hiss. No drama, no final flare, just absence. The room, already dark, sank into deeper shadow, and the pen, after a pause, returned to the page. Because the words were still waiting, because the task was not yet done, because there was always more to copy, whether the light cooperated or not. The wrist was not designed for such work. It was made for lifting, grasping, perhaps even building, but not for the thousands of tiny, repetitive motions required to form a page of script. Each stroke of the quill seemed insignificant in isolation. A small curve here, a fine flick there. But together, they formed an endless sequence of strain, controlled, deliberate, inescapable. The hand hovered just above the parchment, floating on tension, while the wrist served as the fulcrum for every movement. It twisted slightly with each word, bent imperceptibly with every flourish, flexed and locked again and again, hour after hour. There was no variation, no relief. The movement was too small to call labor, yet too constant to ignore. By midday, the ache would begin to pulse faintly beneath the skin. By evening, the bones themselves felt heavier, as if swollen with the day's effort. The swelling came gradually, first as heat beneath the flesh, then as stiffness that resisted both motion and stillness. The tendons along the back of the wrist grew taut and sore, humming with pressure. The joint began to resist the very motions it had memorized. Simple tasks, uncorking an ink pot, rotating the quill for a finer point, grew clumsy. Some scribes wrapped their wrists in strips of cloth, hoping for compression, hoping to trap the pain before it reached the elbow. Others adjusted the angle of their posture, leaning differently, favoring the shoulder instead. But pain only moved. It did not leave. The inflammation became familiar, like an old weight carried from one day to the next, the wrist puffed up by evening, tender to the touch, unyielding to the will. Yet the hand continued to write, moving by habit, driven not by comfort, but by expectation. No one spoke of it. There were no remedies, no oils, no periods of rest offered in the name of health. The work was too sacred, too necessary, too endless. Pages had to be copied. Mistakes had to be scraped. Illuminations had to be colored. And so the wrist, despite its protest, remained on task. The repetition that caused the injury also prevented its healing. There was no time to wait, no days to spare. The pain became part of the rhythm, a dull metronome beneath every letter. Some monks developed permanent swelling, their sleeves stretched tighter around the joint, their grip changed slightly, subtly. The pen was no longer held with grace, but with force. The shape of the script altered, just enough to be noticed, but never enough to stop. The page had to be filled, the line had to continue. The wrist had no vote in the matter. By nightfall, the damage was fully realized. The hand ached, but the wrist throbbed. Lying down brought little relief. The joint still burned, still pulsed with its own rhythm, as though it had continued writing in sleep. Dreams were filled with motion, the constant loop of letters, the endless drag of ink. Even stillness hurt, as if the very absence of movement reminded the body of what had been done. And yet, at dawn, the hand would take up the quill again. The wrist, swollen and sore, would resume its role without argument. No one watched, no one praised. But the words appeared one by one, pulled from a hand that had forgotten what it felt like to rest. This was not dramatic suffering. It was quieter than that. Slower. It lived in the flesh like a second pulse. Not the heartbeat of life, but of labor. Ceaseless, dull, and always just beneath the surface. Books left the scriptorium quietly. There was no ceremony, no farewell, no lingering moment to admire the final page. Once the manuscript was complete, it was taken away, wrapped in cloth, stacked with others, or carried under the arm of a higher-ranking monk who had no part in its creation. It vanished from the place where it was born, leaving behind only a faint impression on the bench where it had rested and a dull ache in the hand that had shaped it. The scribe didn't follow the book's journey. He wasn't told where it would be kept, whether it would be read, whether it would survive. Some went to other monasteries, sent as gifts or tokens of goodwill. Others were locked in libraries, tucked into shelves too high to reach, forgotten except when needed for doctrine or dispute. Many disappeared altogether, lost in fire, stolen, rotted in damp chests beneath leaking roofs. The work was fragile, and so was its memory. The one who had written the text rarely saw it again. Access was controlled. Only certain monks were permitted to handle the volumes once they were bound. The scribe, considered a craftsman rather than a scholar, returned to the next blank page without pause. There was no time for reflection, no chance to revisit what had just been completed. The effort, the errors, the decisions, the countless invisible choices made in the course of creation meant nothing once the final line dried. The book was no longer his. It never had been. It belonged to the monastery, to the church, to the structure that demanded it into being. The hours spent in silence, the physical toll, the mental repetition, all of it vanished with the turning of a single key in a library door. The pages still existed, but the connection to their maker was severed before it could ever take root. Even the most elaborate manuscripts, those filled with color and gold, with intricate borders and illuminated capitals, were treated as objects, not as the result of personal devotion. They were admired, yes, but impersonally. A beautiful book reflected the glory of God or the prestige of the abbey, not the devotion of the individual who had traced every leaf and line. Sometimes an abbot would praise the scriptorium as a whole. Rarely, a visiting scholar might comment on the clarity of a hand, but no one asked who had written it. No one looked into the face of the scribe and said, "This was yours." That idea didn't exist. The labor was anonymous, the result was collective. And so the identity of the book's creator dissolved the moment the cover closed. It became just another volume in a growing archive of silence and repetition. The scribe continued, day after day, making things he would never touch again. He wrote without hope of legacy, without the comfort of ownership, without the privilege of return. He was not permitted to take pride in the work, nor to call it his own. The knowledge he copied was not his to question or use. The prayers he transcribed were not his to shape. The book was never personal. It was always other. A vessel made by one hand to be held by another, passed between minds that would never know the body that gave it form. And still, the pages filled, the ink dried, the bindings tightened, the books disappeared, and the hand, stiff and stained, reached again for the next blank sheet, knowing it too would vanish, just like the last. Fasting was part of the rule. It shaped the rhythm of the day, the mood of the room, and the clarity of the mind. Meals were few, small, and predictable. On fast days, they became almost symbolic. Thin broth, a piece of coarse bread, a few boiled greens. Sometimes, just water, The body adjusted slowly and never fully. Hunger settled in early, quietly at first, a lightness in the belly, a faint pull beneath the ribs. By mid-morning, it became sharper. The stomach spoke in low sounds, twisting and tightening, trying to distract the mind with every skipped beat. Writing on an empty stomach changed the entire act. Focus became fragile, slipping like ink across an oiled surface. The eyes drifted more often, words repeated without meaning. Hands paused longer between letters, as if the body required permission for each movement. But the work could not be paused. The hours still belonged to the page. The rules made no allowances for weakness. If the body suffered, it did so in silence. Hunger was considered spiritual discipline, not a hindrance, and yet the signs were impossible to ignore. Breath grew shallower, muscles in the arms tensed and released without instruction. The mind circled itself, looping through fragments of memory, prayer, and craving. Some monks found themselves rereading the same line over and over again, their eyes moving, but their minds still fixed on the sensation in their gut. The rhythm of the quill faltered. Small mistakes multiplied, missing marks, uneven spacing, accidental smudges where a hand lingered too long. But still, no one left their desk. There was no permission to stop, not for fatigue, not for thirst, not for hunger. The discipline required stillness. The stillness required obedience. And obedience, above all, required endurance. Occasionally a bell would signal the hour of the meal, but on fasting days it brought no comfort. There would be no relief from the ache behind the navel, no interruption to restore strength. Instead, the sound served as a reminder that even nourishment was controlled, rationed, subject to higher judgment. The body grew weaker by degrees. Shoulders sagged, eyes blinked longer, searching for energy in brief flashes of darkness. The candlelight began to blur, stretching the outline of the page into soft confusion. The ink seemed darker than usual. The lines swayed slightly on the parchment. In that moment, hunger was not dramatic. It was dull and steady, like pressure in the head or weight on the chest. It did not scream, it whispered constantly. And through it all, the scribes kept writing, not because they were strong, but because they were not allowed to stop. By evening, the body entered a kind of trance. Movements continued, but thoughts slowed. The pages filled, though the mind barely remembered them. Mistakes went unnoticed. Corrections were deferred. The hunger no longer asked to be fed. It had become the air, the silence, the quill. The monks rose from their benches with effort, their legs stiff, their hands pale. Some swayed slightly when they stood, but steadied themselves quickly, unwilling to be seen as faltering. No one spoke of it. No one counted the days. The fasts returned like seasons and were accepted like weather. The pain was not special. It was not cruel. It was simply part of the work, another layer of difficulty folded quietly into the task. And when the scribe lay down that night, belly empty, hands cramped, eyes burning, there was no dream of food, only of letters, still forming, still repeating, somewhere just beyond the edge of sleep. Mold didn't arrive with force. It crept slowly, almost invisibly, blooming in corners where no light reached, where air refused to circulate. The stone walls of the monastery, cold and porous, held moisture the way others held heat. It gathered beneath shelves, behind closed covers, inside locked chests where precious manuscripts were stored with reverence but not protection. Parchment, once crisp and pale, began to soften and darken at the edges. Spots appeared, small at first, like shadows caught in the wrong place, then spreading, branching like veins across the page. No text was immune. Psalters, gospels, commentaries, all faded in the same slow silence. Letters blurred, pigment bled, illuminations lost their edge. Gold leaf cracked and flaked. The damage was quiet but complete, and the decay irreversible. Even the most careful hands could not undo what the damp had claimed. The scribes knew it would happen. They had seen it before. A volume completed months earlier, tucked safely into the library, retrieved again for reference, now spoiled. The smell was the first sign, sharp, earthy, bitter. Then the texture changed. Pages stuck together or warped away from each other. a book no longer closed cleanly. When opened, it sighed with mildew. Some scribes tried to rescue what they could, scraping mold from the margins, dabbing with vinegar, pressing pages flat with polished stones, but the damage never fully disappeared. Often, the parchment tore in the process. More often, the text faded into unreadable smudges. What had taken weeks to copy, what had been labored over in silence and pain, dissolved with a season of bad rain or a broken window shutter. The walls held the moisture in. The books held it longer. And the belief in permanence began to rot alongside the paper. The idea that these works were eternal, that to write was to defy time, grew harder to accept with each ruined manuscript. Scribes had been told that their labor preserved truth, that their hands fought against the decay of ignorance. But mold didn't care about meaning. It didn't distinguish between scripture and scribble. It crawled across the sacred as easily as it did the mundane. Its patterns were random, its damage indiscriminate. And worst of all, it came back. A book could be dried, cleaned, aired in the sun, wrapped in cloth. And months later, the black bloom would return, silent and soft, beneath the surface. No prayer stopped it. No discipline could undo it. The labor of years could vanish in a single damp season. Pages once filled with light and care became discolored, warped, unpleasant to touch. And still, the scribe wrote more, knowing the fate of his effort before the first word dried. The knowledge changed the nature of the work. The hands did not slow. The ink still flowed. But behind every letter was the quiet understanding that it might not last, that the book could live for a generation or a week, that beauty offered no protection, that reverence was not defense. The effort remained, but the faith in its permanence cracked like the gilded borders on a warped page. Some scribes began to write faster, not out of efficiency, but from impatience. Others hesitated more often, questioning the value of each mark. And yet, they continued, because the task did not require belief, only obedience. The mold could destroy the words, the damp could erase them. But until that happened, the scribe was expected to go on, letter after letter, page after page, preserving what could not be preserved, writing not for eternity, but in spite of it. Grease was never meant to reach the page, yet somehow it always found its way there. A smear from a hand that had just broken bread, a drop that leapt from the edge of a bowl, a fingertip pressed too soon after a shared meal of broth and root vegetables. The food was plain, sparse, and quiet, but it still carried oil, animal fat, butter, sometimes a trace of fish. The scriptorium was no place for eating, but the residue followed the monks back from the refectory, settling invisibly on skin and sleeves. It took only one careless moment for the stain to appear, a translucent blot that spread slowly, darkening the parchment, making the ink separate and flee from the page. Once touched, the surface would never hold pigment the same way again. Letters bled outward, lines lost their edge. A paragraph could dissolve in minutes, undone by something as small as a droplet. There was no fixing it. Grease penetrated too deeply. The parchment, once damaged, could not be scraped like ink or patched like vellum torn by accident. A single stain could render a section unreadable, and worse, unpredictable. Some inks would float on the surface, refusing to dry. Others would sink into the parchment too fast, changing color, becoming blurred. It wasn't only unsightly, it was unstable. A text corrupted by oil would age differently, decay unevenly. Pages buckled around the edges of the stain. Mold grew more easily where the fat had spread. In some cases, the book had to be abandoned entirely, declared unsuitable for copying or reading. And all because of one moment. A hand brought too close to the margin, a sleeve dragged across a fresh page, a moment of distraction after fasting too long and eating too quickly. The scribe bore the blame, even if the gesture had been unconscious. Some monks developed elaborate rituals of cleanliness, washing before work, keeping a cloth between hand and page, refusing food until every tool had been returned to its shelf. Others grew indifferent, having seen too many pages, ruined to care about one more, but the danger remained constant. Even a clean hand could carry invisible traces. Even a sleeve untouched by food could brush against the lips in prayer, then leave a mark where it passed across the parchment. The oil was a quiet, patient threat, never obvious, never dramatic, always waiting. It turned labor into fragility, made every completed line feel temporary. The scribe no longer trusted the page. Even after the ink dried, even after the illumination was finished, there was the thought. A mark could still appear. A hand could still ruin it. A mistake could still reach from the body into the text and take everything away. The fear didn't stop the work. Nothing ever did. But it added weight to the silence. It turned each gesture into a calculation. How far the hand moved, how close the arm rested, how still the breath had to be when leaning forward. Over time, the caution became part of the task, like sharpening the quill or trimming the wick. Pages were handled like glass, not out of reverence, but out of necessity. And when a stain did appear, there was no reaction. No gasp, no curse, not even a pause. Only the quiet folding of the ruined sheet, the careful placing of it aside, and the slow reaching for a fresh one. The ink would be mixed again. The lines would begin anew. But the knowledge remained. Nothing was safe. Not from error, not from the body, not even from the smallest trace of hunger left on the fingertips. The Psalms appeared again and again, on every other page, in every other book, in every other hand. They were copied not once, but dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. The words were familiar before they were even understood. At first, they carried weight. The cadence, the poetry, the sorrow and reverence. Each line held something sacred. But repetition has its own hunger, and it devours meaning slowly, steadily, without pause. Over time, the phrases lost their edge. The sentences became patterns, the verses became rhythm, and the rhythm became noise. Not loud, but constant. A mechanical hum that lived in the hand more than in the mind. The lips no longer mouthed the phrases. The breath no longer paused at the ends of lines. The pen moved forward with the same motion it used for anything else. The Psalms were no longer scripture. They were structure. The mind drifted as the hand continued. Thoughts wandered far from the text, tracing paths through memory, through hunger, through cold. The eyes saw the words, but they no longer registered meaning. Some lines became invisible. Others reappeared in dreams. Occasionally, a scribe would forget mid-page whether a line had already been written. He would go back, read it again, and find nothing familiar in the shape of it. It wasn't amnesia, it was something deeper, a kind of erasure created by overexposure. Meaning faded, not because it was weak, but because it was overused. Too much reverence can dull the sacred until it becomes furniture, present, unmoving, unnoticed. The Psalms, once written to uplift and to console, now echoed without clarity. Their words circled the walls like chant that never stopped, too soft to ignore, too constant to hear. Some monks resisted. They paused between verses, forced themselves to read aloud, tried to remember the power each phrase was supposed to carry. But even this effort became habit. Even the resistance became routine. The discipline required speed, precision, silence. Contemplation slowed the hand, made the lines uneven. There was no space for awe inside the lines of the scriptorium. The sacred had to be copied without interruption, without indulgence, without reaction. Understanding was not the goal. Preservation was. And so the words passed through the body without touching it. Like water over stone, like wind through broken glass. They were never questioned, but they were no longer felt. The page filled with divine names, with ancient lamentations, with whispered promises. And the scribe moved on, unaware of what had just been written. The books were read by others, by priests, by scholars, by men who believed they were encountering something untouched. They traced the lines with their eyes, thinking of the soul behind them, the care, the faith. But the truth was colder. The faith had long ago given way to repetition. The sacred had become silent. The scribe did not copy what he loved. He copied what he was told. The psalms remained unchanged, but the eyes that wrote them grew dim, the hands grew tired, and the mind eventually stopped listening, not out of disrespect, not out of rebellion, but because no word, no matter how holy, can survive endless repetition without losing its breath. And still, the work continued, because the words were sacred, even when no one was left to feel it. The smell of parchment was impossible to forget. It clung to everything, the skin, the robes, the air inside the nostrils. A blend of lime, old flesh, and the faintest trace of smoke from the drying process. It had no comparison. It was not pleasant, not foul, just persistent. Even freshly prepared sheets, crisp and pale, carried it in full force. With age, the smell deepened, becoming denser, more acidic, soaked with the oils of countless hands. The scriptorium was filled with it, the sharp tang of hide once soaked in lye, the ghost of the animal it had once been. It was strongest in the morning, when the benches were still cold and the tools still dry. As the day went on, the warmth of human breath and candle flame stirred it into motion, making it thicker, more immediate. The smell didn't come in waves. It was constant, like dust in the lungs. Even outside the walls of the scriptorium, the scent followed. In the cloister, in the chapel, even in sleep. It settled into the fibers of robes, into the dry folds of cloth wrapped around the wrists. No amount of water removed it. Monks carried the odor like a second skin, faint but always present. The nose adjusted to it, but never fully. It lingered in the back of the throat, rising again when meals were eaten, when prayers were sung. The scent became tied to memory itself, the turning of pages, the drag of a knife across flesh-thin sheets, the slow filling of a line. Sometimes the scribe would stand in fresh air and still smell parchment, not in the air around him, but within, as if the body had absorbed it into the blood, as if the lungs had stored it like breath. It was not a smell that faded, it was one that stayed. Over time, the association became complete. The smell no longer reminded one of parchment. It became the definition of labor, of repetition, of unending days bent in silence. Even the memory of light or cold or exhaustion was somehow wrapped in it. The body responded before the mind did. A whiff in passing would trigger stiffness in the fingers, a tightening behind the eyes. Some monks described dreams filled not with images but with scent alone, the overwhelming presence of dried hide and faint mildew, filling a world where pages turned endlessly. Others claimed they couldn't smell incense anymore, or that the scent of food had dulled. The parchment had overwritten it all. There were moments in prayer when the book was not even open, and still the air tasted of it. It was inescapable, not out of malice, but because the work never truly ended, even when the writing stopped. Eventually, the distinction between scribe and surface blurred. The same hands that touched the page bore its scent. The breath that dried the ink carried it forward. The words written were not just holy, they were saturated with the physical remains of what had once lived, scraped, stretched, and dried. The smell reminded the scribe of that process constantly, without asking. It was not a clean scent, it was not clean work, but it was permanent. More permanent than memory, more permanent than the ink. The parchment would one day decay, would curl and crack and crumble into dust. But the smell, once taken in, once breathed for years without pause, would remain. It was a mark not left on the book, but on the body, unseen, unnamed, and utterly irreversible. The chanting began early and lasted for hours. It echoed through the stone corridors, soft and steady, sometimes barely more than a murmur, other times rising in waves that pressed faintly against the walls of the scriptorium. The voices weren't distinct. They blared into one another, syllables overlapping, melodies folding inward until all that remained was tone. It came from the chapel, from the cloister, from rooms beyond the scribe's reach, but never beyond hearing. The sound didn't interrupt the work. It was too consistent for that. It didn't demand attention. It simply filled the space the way light might if it could travel through stone. The humming resonance of plain chant, unbroken and repetitive, wrapped around the scratch of the quill, seeping into the silence until silence itself seemed shaped by it. The page caught the rhythm, the hand adapted to it. Even the breath adjusted its pace. At first, it had been distracting. The mind tried to catch the words, to follow the cadence, to join the prayer. But the attempt never lasted. The chant moved too slowly, with too much sameness. The voices rose and fell without punctuation, and the mind, already fatigued by repetition on the page, gave up trying to make sense of repetition in sound. Eventually, it stopped listening. Not in rejection, but in adaptation. The music became background, not like the noise of the world, but like the internal hum of the body. It didn't break concentration, it joined it. The scribe's hand moved in time with vowels held too long and intervals that never resolved. The rhythm of the chant was different from that of thought. It didn't provoke, it didn't ask, it remained. A constant thread behind the motion of ink across skin, behind the ache in the back, behind the scent of candle smoke and drying glue. Even on days when the work was slow, the chanting helped keep time. It didn't measure hours precisely, but it gave the day shape. The same phrases returned at the same moments, like distant bells that never had to be rung. Certain lines in the text would begin just as a familiar antiphon echoed in from the side chapel. Certain strokes of the quill always seemed to land as a voice dipped into a final note. Over time, these coincidences became expected, then necessary. When the chant paused, when the monks fell silent for a reading, or when the choir changed location, the scriptorium felt emptier. Colder, too quiet, even for its own rules. The scratching of quills became too sharp. The cough of a fellow scribe felt louder than usual. In those moments, the absence of chant was more noticeable than its presence. The silence felt naked. Something essential was missing. The sound never became emotional. It never surged or swelled or invited catharsis. It did not stir the soul or pull tears from the eyes. It simply existed, like a second architecture built of breath and tone. For the scribes, it was neither comfort nor burden. It was a condition, like the chill in winter or the stiffness of the bench. And yet, without anyone realizing it, the music entered the manuscripts. Not in notes or symbols, but in rhythm, in flow, in the way the letters leaned or the space between lines fell naturally into a kind of order. The chant became part of the page, not because it was heard, but because it was lived, written into the white between the black, heard not with the ear, but with the movement of the hand. By the time the book was finished, it carried the memory of voices long faded, still sounding somewhere behind the script, in a place that no longer needed sound at all. The bindings failed quietly. No cracking, no sudden collapse, just a slow unspooling of order. The damp entered first, soaking into the walls during rain, lingering in the cold breath of stone during winter. It didn't rush toward the shelves, but crept in over time, settling into the thread, into the leather, into the glue. Stitch by stitch, the bindings loosened. The cords stretched and frayed, the boards of the covers swelled and warped. Pages no longer lay flat, but curled inward or upward, pulled by forces too small to see. A book that had once closed cleanly now bulged at the edges. A spine that had once been tight now sagged in the center. What had been whole began to unravel, not through misuse, but through air, through time, through moisture that never left completely. Leather reacted worst of all. Once polished and firm, it grew mottled and soft, the surface speckled with bloom or darkened into greasy patches. Some bindings began to flake, leaving behind fragments like brittle bark. Others cracked down the center, splitting along seams that had once been strong. The pages within suffered in their own way. Damp parchment didn't rot immediately. It twisted. The sheets became wavy, their surfaces dimpled and uneven. Ink lifted from the surface in places, darkened in others. Illuminations peeled at the edges. Gold leaf lost its shine, clinging to the facing page in delicate, accidental transfer. The smell of mildew rose from the joints, subtle but unmistakable. Some volumes had to be opened slowly, not out of reverence, but to prevent further tearing. Others refused to open at all, their stiffness hiding fractures beneath the surface. Repair was possible, but always temporary. Threads could be replaced, spines rebuilt, covers reinforced, but the materials were the same, and so the cycle repeated. The same air that had destroyed the last binding was still there to destroy the new one. The monks who worked in repair were often the same who had copied the books to begin with, forced to return to tasks they had long since completed. It was not like rewriting, it was like burying the sick, a labor of inevitability. They saw their own work in fragments, half-ruined pages, bindings they remembered stitching with care, now split and peeling. The past returned, not in memory, but in failure. Every hour spent on repair was an hour lost from new copying. The balance tipped. Preservation became more urgent than creation. The old pushed out the new, and the scribes worked longer. There was no end to it. Every book stored was a book waiting to be damaged. Every change in season brought new threats. The scriptorium produced faster than the library could preserve. The illusion of permanence wore thin. What was written with such care was undone with such ease. Water didn't need to flood, just linger. Coal didn't need to break, it only needed to stay. And all the while, the work continued. New pages, new bindings, new hands tracing the same words, even as the words from years before dissolved, folded, faded. The books decayed quietly, and no one was surprised. Only the task remained unchanged. The scribe still wrote, the monk still shelved, the parchment still curled. The binding still gave way. It was not tragedy, it was routine. And within that routine, the idea of preservation itself became something both noble and absurd. The pages were never safe, but they were written anyway. The knife was always close, closer than the quill, closer than the ink. It lay beside the parchment, sharp and plain, not for defense, not for carving, but for correction. Every error had to be removed, not crossed out, not rewritten, erased entirely from the flesh of the page. The blade scraped slowly across the surface of the parchment, lifting the ink in thin curls, shaving the top layer of skin from the page. It had to be done with care. Too much pressure, and the sheet would tear. Too little, and the ink would remain, smudged into something worse than a mistake. The sound was faint, but distinct. A dry whisper of metal on skin. The process was unforgiving. A single careless stroke, and a day's labor could collapse. Every scribe learned the motion early, but mastery came only after hours of quiet damage. The parchment bore the scars. So did the hands. The knife was not a tool of violence, but it left wounds. Fingers, already stiff and raw from holding the quill, were often nicked during correction. A slip in concentration, a tremble from cold or fatigue, and the edge found flesh instead of skin. The cuts were shallow, usually, but deep enough to bleed. Ink mixed with blood on more than one occasion. Cloth wrapped around the hand was no help. Too thick, too clumsy. The fingers had to be bare, exposed to feel the grain of the page, to sense the tension in the parchment. Pain became just another sensation among many. Alongside the ache of the spine, the burn of the eyes, the throb in the wrist. A red-stained margin was not rare. The books were silent, but the hands that made them bore quiet testimony to the price of precision. Sometimes the knife was used more than the pen. On difficult days, when focus failed and mistakes multiplied, the scraping seemed endless. A single line rewritten 3 times. A passage removed and replaced. A page started, corrected again, then discarded. The knife moved constantly, shaping the page as much as the words did. It was not an interruption to the work. It was part of it. Some scribes grew faster with the blade than with the quill. They worked in cycles. Write, scrape, write again. The scent of shaved parchment filled the air, sharp and organic, like something being skinned. The surface of the sheet thinned with each correction, becoming translucent, fragile, more likely to tear at the edges. But the work had to be clean. The page had to look untouched, even when it had been scraped raw. The illusion of perfection mattered more than the effort it took to create it. The knife left no praise. A well-executed correction earned no acknowledgement. It was invisible by design. The better the scribe became with the blade, the more his work vanished into the page. The goal was to remove all trace of error, not only from the surface, but from memory. But some errors lingered. Some passages resisted correction. Some days ended with more shavings on the floor than lines on the page. And still, the scribe kept the knife near, always ready. It was not a symbol of failure. It was a companion, a reminder that perfection was not assumed. It was enforced. Letter by letter, cut by cut. The blade moved as steadily as the pen, sometimes more so. In a room devoted to silence, it was the knife that made the sound of labor. Slow, dry, deliberate. Not a flourish, not an accident. Just the slow removal of what should never have been. Individuality had no place in the scriptorium. The scribes were not chosen for their voices, their ideas, or their creativity. They were chosen for their obedience, their steadiness, and their ability to disappear into the task. The person who held the quill mattered less than the consistency of the script. There was no signature, no flourish, no identifying mark to set one hand apart from another. The uniformity was the point. Pages were expected to look identical, as though written by no one at all. The handwriting had to conform to standard forms, no deviations, no inventions. To write in one's own style was not expression, but error. The scribe was not a writer. He was a conduit. Words passed through him, but not from him. His thoughts were irrelevant. His preferences were invisible. The labor demanded a complete surrender of self. No one asked what the scribe believed. It did not matter whether he loved the text, whether he understood it, whether he agreed with it. The task was to copy, not to think, to replicate, not to interpret. The eyes read, the hand moved, and the mind was expected to stay quiet. To insert a note, a question, a hesitation, was to break the silence of the page. Even marginalia, when permitted, had to follow convention, had to stay in the assigned space, had to be purely factual. There was no room for personality, no invitation to contribute. The work was sacred, but the worker was not. To assert a self within the labor was to challenge the order of the monastery itself. So the scribes erased themselves. They became still, became neutral, became consistent. Identity was not stripped violently, it was simply not needed. And so it faded, slowly, without resistance. Over time, the effect deepened. The act of writing became mechanical. The body trained to move without interruption. The mind trained not to wander. The voice, unused, grew weak. The face, unrecognized, grew indistinct. No scribe was more important than the book he copied, and no book carried his name. Praise, if it came at all, was for the finished volume, for the preservation of truth, for the beauty of the work, but not for the hands behind it. When one scribe grew old, or sick, or blind, another took his place, and the line of text continued as if nothing had changed. There was no ceremony, no farewell. The books were to be remembered. The people who made them were not. That was the point. It was the purpose of the vocation, to vanish into the task so completely that the task became all that remained. And so, the scribes disappeared. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Voice, then face, then thought. What remained was the motion of the hand and the quiet rhythm of labor. The name was never written. The opinion was never spoken. The self was never acknowledged. But the pages filled anyway, line after line, book after book, made by people who were not supposed to exist in the margins of their own work. It was not cruel. It was not even personal. It was simply how the system was built. For the word to survive, the speaker had to vanish. And so he did. The letters remained perfectly shaped, perfectly spaced, but the man who made them became just another silence between the lines. The eyes began to change long before anyone spoke of it. The blurring crept in quietly, first in the late afternoon, then by midday, then as soon as the quill touched the parchment. Letters that were once sharp and distinct began to soften at the edges. The contrast faded, lines shimmered faintly under candlelight, and the black of the ink bled into the pale surface of the page. At first, it was dismissed as fatigue or poor lighting. A day of rest seemed to help, briefly, but the improvement never lasted. Over time, the blurring became constant. Some letters looked doubled, some vanished into the page entirely. Mistakes increased, corrections followed. And then the knife was used more than the pen. The scribe continued to write, not because he saw clearly, but because the act of writing had become independent of vision. It was no longer sight guiding the hand, but memory, habit, repetition. By the age of 40, many had already learned to hide the strain. There was no shame in it, only inevitability. Candlelight worsened the decline. Hours spent squinting at narrow lines, copying cramped text onto flawed parchment, wore down the eyes the way water wears stone. There were no spectacles, no lenses to compensate. Some attempted to adjust their distance to the page. Others angled their heads to let more light reach the surface, but nothing reversed the loss. The world beyond the page also began to fade. Faces became vague, objects blurred at a distance. The edge of the desk lost its definition. Reading was no longer reading, it was deciphering. Every letter required confirmation. Every word was a guess. And still, the expectation remained unchanged. The page must be filled. The words must be correct. The ink must not smudge. The hands must not falter. If the eyes failed, the body was expected to make up the difference. There was no ritual for blindness. It wasn't discussed in chapter or confession. It arrived silently and was endured the same way. Some scribes were quietly reassigned to simpler tasks, ruling lines, binding pages, preparing parchment. Others were allowed to continue, their errors corrected by younger monks, their work quietly redone when necessary. No one was punished for decline, but no one was excused from effort. The labor remained, the tools remained, the page remained. And the scribe, whose belief had once burned brightly, now stared through a haze, reciting familiar verses without seeing the shapes that carried them. Faith blurred alongside vision, not from doubt, but from exhaustion. The words still held meaning, but not for the eyes, and no longer for the mind. Repetition replaced conviction. The body remembered what the spirit no longer questioned. And the work went on. By the time true blindness arrived, it was no longer feared. It had been lived with for years in partial forms. The world dimmed, then vanished. Not in darkness, but in greyness. A slow erasure of detail. Those who had spent their lives writing sacred texts now walked by memory, guided by sound and habit. Some still sat in the scriptorium, hands idle, breathing in the air that had shaped them. The work had passed to others. The pages continued to fill, but the scribe remained, a body moulded by silence, by letters, by years of seeing what no longer could be seen. He did not mourn the loss of sight. He had long since lost the act of looking. And yet, the page lived on. The ink dried, the books multiplied, the words endured. Only the eyes had vanished, quietly, as they always had. The novices stood behind the scribes in silence, their hands clasped or at their sides, their eyes fixed on the slow, deliberate motion of the pen. They didn't speak. They didn't interrupt. They watched, hour after hour, as the older monks copied line after line with stiff fingers and aching backs. This was how instruction began, not with lessons, but with observation. No explanations were given, no shortcuts offered. The novices were expected to learn through proximity, through imitation, through witnessing the labor of others. They watched the same posture maintained without change, the same wrist movement repeated for hours. They saw the pauses, the corrections, the quiet tremble of a hand held too long in one position. Every mistake became a warning, every gesture a rule. There was no demonstration of technique, only a long, quiet exposure to someone else's endurance. Eventually, they were given dull blades and scraps of ruined parchment. Their first letters were crude, uneven, trembling. The ink pooled and bled. The knife tore more than it shaved. They practiced the same curves again and again, their pages covered not in words, but in fragments, broken strokes and false starts. But still, no one corrected them aloud. There were no guiding hands. They were left to learn the shape of discipline on their own. They understood quickly that comfort was not part of the task. The benches were no softer for the young. The cold reached them just as easily. And still they stayed, watching, practicing, failing. Some left, some were reassigned. But those who remained learned that pain was part of the trade, that to write was not to create, but to endure. They watched as the older scribes winced with each motion, as swollen fingers fumbled with quills, as knuckles cracked just to keep moving. They saw the red-rimmed eyes, the hunched spines, the bandaged wrists. No one explained the cost. No one needed to. The novices saw it every day, worn into the bodies of those they would soon become. The lesson was not written in ink. It was written in posture, in silence, in repetition. When they began real work, they copied the same texts under the same conditions, using the same tools, facing the same struggles. The pain came in the same places, at the same hours. And when it did, there was no surprise, only recognition. They had seen it all before, on someone else's face, in someone else's hands. Now it belonged to them. Over time, the cycle repeated. The novices became scribes. New novices took their places at the back of the room, watching the same process unfold. Nothing changed. The same mistakes were made, the same pages ruined, the same lessons learned too late. Each generation of scribes inherited the suffering of the last, not through teaching, but through imitation. There were no secrets to be passed down, only labor, only time. And so the knowledge of the craft was preserved, not in words, but in scars, in habits, in the quiet endurance of those who understood that mastery was not a goal, but a condition. They had watched others suffer, and then they did the same, not because they lacked imagination, but because the work demanded it, and no one ever told them otherwise. The candles were always burning, short, narrow, slow to melt in winter and too quick in summer. They lined the scriptorium, not for comfort, but necessity. Their flames flickered with every draught, casting restless shadows across the parchment and into the eyes of the scribes. Wax dripped constantly, small sudden drops that gathered at the edge of the wick, hesitated for a breath, then fell without warning. They landed on wood, on page, on fabric, and often on skin. The sensation was sharp, immediate, and absolute. A bead of hot wax striking the back of the hand sent a jolt of pain that flared bright and then dulled into a steady burn. There was rarely time to react. The scribe's hand stayed where it was, hovering above the page, careful not to smudge the ink, careful not to lift before the line was finished. The injury was minor but constant. Just one more discomfort among many. The wax hardened quickly, forming pale blisters that adhered to the skin and cooled into brittle shells. They could be scraped away, but the skin beneath was often red, tender, raw. Most left them untouched. The burns were so common that they ceased to be noticed, part of the background hum of bodily complaint that came with the work. Some scribes bore hands flecked with scar tissue, small shiny marks on knuckles and fingers that told a quiet story of long hours and careless candles. Others developed the habit of working around the drips, angling their hands differently, shifting the position of the candle to one side, though this often meant worse lighting, and with it, more strain on the eyes. A clean desk was a luxury. Most were mottled with wax residue, ink stains, and the faint reddish spots where accidents had bled through the skin. The page was sacred, but the hand was expendable. There were no protests, no effort to improve the setup. The candles had always been there, and the burns had always come with them. The scribes didn't stop writing. They didn't even pause. A drop of wax was acknowledged with a blink, a flinch, perhaps a tightening of the jaw, but never with a word. The work could not wait for pain. Ink dried too fast, hands stiffened if still too long. And so the body learned to absorb the injury without reaction, to accept the sting as part of the rhythm. The wax was not malicious. It was simply present, another element of the room like dust or cold or silence. It was not an interruption. It was a companion. And over time, the flesh stopped distinguishing between what hurt and what didn't. There was only sensation and the task. By the end of the day, the burns would ache more than they had at the moment of impact. Skin would swell slightly. Fabric would rub against it during prayer. In sleep, The memory of heat would pulse beneath the surface, but by morning, the same hands would reach again for the quill. The same wax would fall. The same marks would form. Nothing changed. The pages filled despite it all. Or perhaps because of it. Pain became part of the quiet endurance that bound the scribes together, not through words or shared glances, but through the shared understanding of how a small wound could be ignored, how the sacredness of the task outweighed the sting. The burns did not end the work. They continued beneath it. The wax fell. The ink dried. The skin healed. The page endured. Night didn't mean rest. In the monastery, darkness was not a signal to sleep, but a shifting of pace. There were nights when the scriptorium remained lit, not with the warm, flickering glow of daytime candles, but with the colder, wavering shimmer of oil lamps. Their light was steadier, longer lasting, but dimmer and smoky, casting a haze that made the parchment seem damp and the ink less black. Those hours were the hardest, not because of pain or discomfort, but because of the slow unraveling of awareness. The body obeyed, but the mind staggered. Eyes struggled to hold focus, the lines blurred, and sentences looped like prayers half remembered. The silence deepened to something unnatural, pierced only by the scratch of quills and the rare groan of a stool shifting beneath a tired body. Sleep didn't arrive gently. It waited just outside the edge of vision, pulling at the corners, dulling the senses one at a time. Sometimes a head would dip, not in prayer, but in sheer collapse. A moment later, it would rise again, and the hand would continue, as if nothing had happened. Pages bore the signs of these slips, smudged letters, repeated lines, the occasional droplet of drool or twitch of ink across a margin. Corrections were made hastily with knives or scraped off entirely, but the underlying truth remained. These were texts born of exhaustion. Not devotion alone, but fatigue pressed into every curve of the script. Those who wrote at night moved through a fog that blurred the border between labor and dream. Psalms turned to patterns, the repetition numbed thought, and the act of copying holy words became less an offering and more a trance. They did not write from clarity, they wrote from compulsion, from duty, from the strange machinery of monastic discipline that valued completion above clarity of mind. There was no reward for writing through the night, no recognition, no morning reprieve. The next day arrived as always, with bells, with prayer, with another set of pages to fill. The brief moments of sleep they found were not restorative, but fragmentary, broken into shallow intervals during communal silence or stolen beneath the guise of prayer. The body learned to function in pieces. Muscles moved out of habit. Eyes blinked more slowly, less often. Thoughts came late and left quickly. And yet, the pages still filled. Not perfectly, not always beautifully, but steadily, one after another. The rhythm of the pen outlasted the rhythm of the breath. They did not need to be awake to work. They only needed to remain upright. By the end of such a night, the body would feel foreign, limbs prickled with heaviness. The spine ached from hours of stillness. The stomach felt hollow, but not hungry. And the mind floated somewhere between memory and instinct, aware of time only through candle lengths and the ache in the shoulders. Outside, the world darkened further. Wind tapped against shutters, animals stirred in the stables, frost gathered on stone. But inside the scriptorium, the only weather was oil smoke and cold ink. This was not meditation. It was not reflection. It was the quiet erosion of self in service of a task with no end. And when the lamp finally guttered and the ink pot ran dry and the bell for morning prayer rang, no one spoke. They simply stood, closed the books, and walked into another day that would not ask how the night had been spent, because it already knew. The books never stayed. That was understood from the beginning. Once complete, the pages were bound, inspected, wrapped, and sent away to other monasteries, noble patrons, cathedral libraries, or distant abbeys in lands the scribe would never see. The ink dried, the illuminations sparkled under a final breath of candlelight, and the manuscript disappeared through the stone archway as quietly as it had come. There was no ceremony, no farewells. The script, once memorized through repetition, was no longer theirs to look at. It passed into the hands of others, of clerics, of bishops, of kings. And the desk, still warm from elbows and wrists, remained exactly where it had been. Waiting, ready. Another stack of parchment was brought out, another candle lit. The rhythm resumed as if nothing had been lost, as if the hundreds of hours poured into that one object had vanished with no echo. Because they had. No one asked where the books went. That was not a scribe's place. He did not own the work he created. The act of writing was enough. Or rather, it had to be. There was no signature, no mark, not even a flourish in the margin to signal presence. The scribe did not exist outside of his work, and once that work departed, he became blank again. A hand, a tool, a silent participant in a process too large to notice his absence. The books carried the words of God, the doctrines of saints, the laws of the church. His own story remained unwritten, pressed into the grain of the wood he leaned on and the calluses of his fingers. The outside world read the lines, but never knew the eyes that had strained to form them, or the body that had weakened in the cold to make them legible. He was, in the truest sense, invisible. Still, the memory of the work lingered, but not as pride. Pride was discouraged. What remained was a faint ache, the knowledge that something of him had gone far while he had stayed behind. The door he would never pass through had opened and closed for his creations. The streets he would never walk had felt the weight of his labor carried across them in silence. And yet, each day he woke in the same stone cell, washed in the same basin, passed the same cloister walk, and sat once more at the same table. The candle stubs changed, the seasons shifted, but he did not. The movement in his life existed only in the objects he produced, never in his own body. Even his dreams began to fill with pages he would never see again. In time, it became easier not to care, to focus on the ink, not the destination, the labor, not the legacy. He learned to see beauty in the quiet repetition, to find meaning in the daily cycle that never changed. The arrival of new parchment became a small event, the mixing of pigments a quiet triumph. He found peace in the rows of letters, even as his joints stiffened and his breath grew shallower in winter. And when a finished volume was taken from his hands, he no longer watched it leave. He simply lowered his gaze to the next blank sheet. It was not apathy. It was endurance. A kind of faith, perhaps. Not in the church, but in the simple truth that words could live far beyond their makers. And that was enough. Or at least, it had to be. The first stroke of the quill was no different than yesterday's. A new page lay before the scribe, blank and soft with the faint scent of stretched animal skin. The candlelight flickered, casting the same weary shadows across the table, the same curve of the inkhorn, the same tremble in the edge of his vision. The ink, thick and dark, clung to the nib like memory. He had done this before, thousands of times, each letter guided by habit, not inspiration. Each psalm, though sacred, repeated so often it had dissolved into shape and rhythm, devoid of meaning. The chant beyond the walls echoed the same verses, the same melodies, the days stacked like the pages, uniform and indistinct. New lines were not truly new. They were variations of the same prayer, the same hope, copied from a book that had itself been copied, in a chain that stretched backward through hands long cold. There was no end. Only continuation. The body obeyed, but it did not forget. Each motion, though small, carried weight. The fingers stiffened faster now. The wrist ached before noon. The back bent forward without asking permission. And yet, none of it surprised him. Pain had become a kind of silence in its own right, a background presence, like the whiff of wax or the rustle of robes in the hallway. He did not fight it. He adapted. When the joints refused to move cleanly, he paused. Not for comfort, but for precision. The margin could not be broken. The angle of each line had to remain perfect. The habit of excellence drilled in from years of correction had become as natural as breath. He no longer thought of the outside world, nor wondered if he had missed something. There was only this, the parchment, the ink, the candle, and the motion that bridged them. Outside, Time shifted. Leaves fell and returned. Snow gathered and melted. The sun moved across the heavens, indifferent to the cloistered world beneath it. Inside the scriptoria, none of that mattered. Seasons did not affect the psalms. Weather did not interrupt the obligation. Whether the day was bright or dim, the work endured. And with each finished line came another. Not celebration, not even relief. Just a momentary breath before the next cycle began. A new sheet placed with careful fingers. A sharpened quill tested on the edge of the desk. A faint prayer murmured, not out of piety, but ritual. Something to mark the beginning, even when the beginning was indistinguishable from everything before it. The repetition was not mindless. It was survival. Identity dissolved into routine, and routine preserved the scribe. In the end, it wasn't about the books. Not really. Those would leave. Be read or not. Preserved or not. What stayed was the rhythm, the deep, ceaseless rhythm of repetition. It filled the gaps where joy might have lived. It dulled the sharpness of longing. It carved a quiet path through days that otherwise would have crumbled. And as another psalm took shape beneath the scribe's hand, he did not think of its meaning. He did not recall the first time he had written it. He did not wonder how many more times it would pass beneath his fingers. He simply continued, because that is what had always been done. That is what would always be done. And in the hush of the scriptoria, that steady motion, unnoticed, unchanging, was the closest thing to eternity. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine illuminated manuscripts as relics of beauty, devotion, and purpose. But behind every graceful letter was a strained hand. Behind every gilded margin was a body stiff with repetition. The monks and scribes who copied these texts did not chase glory. They did not expect thanks. They worked in silence, often in discomfort, with no promise that their names would survive even a single generation. And yet, they kept writing, page after page, year after year. They copied, not for fame, but because the task existed, and so it had to be done. In that quiet persistence lies something deeper than inspiration. Endurance, patience, a kind of invisible faith not just in the divine, but in the act itself. If tonight's story helped you feel grounded, still, or even just a little more at peace, I'm glad you stayed until the end. Rest well now. You've earned it.